Dearest listeners, there exists in this world a peculiar cruelty reserved exclusively for young ladies of fortune and breeding. The relentless scrutiny of one's reflection in an unforgiving looking glass. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a young woman who gazed into such a glass and found not vanity's usual concerns, but rather the unsettling whisper of a question that would alter the very course of her existence. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The spring of 1815 found Miss Eloise Grenville in the enviable position of being 21 years of age, possessed of considerable accomplishments, and situated as the beloved daughter of their graces, the Duke and Duchess of Waverley. That she was beautiful could not be disputed by even the most censorious matrons of the ton, though her beauty bore an exotic quality that set her apart from the pale, golden-haired young ladies who typically graced the drawing rooms of Mayfair. On a particular evening in late April, as the household of Waverley Manor prepared for the grand ball that would mark the opening of their London season, Eloise sat before her dressing table whilst her lady's maid arranged the dark masses of her hair. The looking-glass reflected back a countenance of striking contrast, hair as black as a raven's wing, eyes of the deepest brown, and skin that bore warmth despite the current fashion for pallor. It was not vanity that held Eloise's attention, but rather a creeping sense of otherness that had begun to manifest with increasing frequency. She found her gaze drifting to the miniature portrait of her grace that sat upon the vanity, the Duchess Catherine, with cornflower blue eyes and hair like spun gold, bearing not a single feature that found its echo in Eloise's own countenance. His Grace, the Duke Richard Grenville, was similarly fair, as had been every ancestor whose portrait lined the gallery at Waverley Manor. The question pressed forward with uncomfortable insistence: to whom precisely did she bear resemblance? Her maid departed, and Eloise moved to the small writing desk where she kept her most precious possessions. Among them was a miniature of the Duchess, painted when her Grace was but 18. Eloise held it beside her own reflection, and searched desperately for some shared feature that might quiet the unease in her heart. There was none. The ball at Waverley Manor that evening overwhelmed the senses from the moment one entered. The sweet strain of violins floated through air thick with the mingled scent of beeswax candles and hothouse roses, while hundreds of flames reflected endlessly in gilded mirrors, transforming the ballroom into a shimmering dreamscape. The rustle of silk against silk created a constant whisper beneath the murmur of refined conversation, and jewels caught the light at every throat and wrist, a constellation of wealth and privilege gathered beneath painted ceilings depicting classical mythology. Eloise descended the grand staircase with her Grace at precisely the appointed hour, her gown of white silk adorned with delicate embroidery, pearls at her throat that had belonged to the previous Duchess. The evening progressed through its expected phases. The receiving line where Eloise executed perfect curtsies and exchanged pleasantries with the endless stream of guests, the opening quadrille where she partnered with young Lord Hartley, whose conversation proved as uninspired as his dancing, the careful navigation of the social waters that required a young lady to appear sought after without seeming fast, engaged without appearing bookish, beautiful without vanity. It was during a brief respite when Eloise had been prevailed upon to display her accomplishments at the pianoforte that the evening took an unexpected turn. As she rose from the instrument, her eyes fell upon Lady Montrose, speaking to companions in a voice that carried rather further than discretion might have advised. The words reached Eloise with perfect clarity. One might marvel at how the Duchess had produced such a dark-haired daughter when both their Graces were so remarkably fair. Perhaps there was some foreign influence in her Grace's family that had failed to manifest until this generation? The remainder of the evening passed in a peculiar haze. Lord Edmund Carstairs, a gentleman of some 35 years, whose persistence in pursuing her attention had become increasingly difficult to deflect, claimed her for 2 dances, the maximum permitted, a declaration of particular interest that did not escape notice. As the evening drew toward midnight, Eloise slipped away to the library, that sanctuary where she had spent so many happy hours of her childhood. She moved to the shelves that held the leather-bound volumes of family records and drew down the book of lineage that covered the years of her birth. The pages revealed what she had begun to suspect. There were no entries marking her arrival as an infant. The first mention of Eloise Grenville appeared when she would have been perhaps 2 years of age, a notation that made no reference to birth or christening. She continued her search until she found what she sought, a letter, yellowed with age, tucked between pages. It was a hurried note in the handwriting of what appeared to be the Duke's estate steward from that era, making reference to the babe found at the gates and the decision of their graces to maintain the strictest discretion. The phrasing was businesslike, logistical rather than emotional, yet the implications were staggering. The rustle of silk at the doorway announced the Duchess. Her Grace crossed the room and stood beside Eloise near the shelves of family history, her expression holding love, certainly, but also apprehension and perhaps relief that a long-anticipated moment had finally arrived. Eloise spoke of what she had found, of questions growing in her mind, of the terrible need to understand who she truly was. Her Grace listened without interruption, and when Eloise's confession ended, the Duchess drew her into an embrace that spoke of love transcending the bonds of blood. She confirmed what the letter suggested. Eloise had been found as an infant of perhaps 3 months, abandoned with only the finest shawl and a note begging whoever found her to provide care that her mother could not. The Duchess spoke of her own grief that year, of the daughter she had borne and lost within hours, of the emptiness that had threatened to consume her. Finding Eloise had seemed a gift from Providence itself. They had raised her as their own because, her Grace insisted with fierce tenderness, she was their own in every way that mattered. The revelations ought to have brought comfort, yet Eloise found herself caught between gratitude and a desperate hunger to know where she had come from, who had given her life before abandoning her. The Duchess did not attempt to dissuade her from seeking answers. Instead, she offered information long kept in reserve. The night Eloise had been found was forever seared into her Grace's memory. March of 1794, bitterly cold, with the infant wrapped in a shawl of extraordinary quality. There had been a note signed only with the initial V, and a small silver locket bearing the same initial. These items had been preserved. The Duchess would give them to Eloise, along with her blessing to seek whatever answers she needed. As they returned to the ballroom, her Grace offered one final piece of information. Lord Sebastian Marlowe, the Duke's nephew and Eloise's childhood companion, would be returning to Waverley Manor on the morrow after an absence of 6 years. The morning following the ball brought weather that matched Eloise's turbulent emotions. Gray skies threatening rain, wind stripping early blossoms from trees. She rose early despite the late hour at which the ball had concluded, unable to settle to any of her usual occupations. She found herself drawn to the windows overlooking the circular drive, watching with intensity she could not explain for Sebastian's arrival. It was approaching 11:30 when the sound of carriage wheels drew her to press closer to the glass. The gentleman who emerged from the traveling coach struck Eloise with the force of physical impact. This was not the youth she remembered, not the 18-year-old who had departed with promises to write. This was a man in the full prime of his 24 years, tall and broad-shouldered, his face having lost the softness of youth. Even from her vantage point, she could see his countenance bore an expression of carefully controlled emotion. Her heart was beating with uncomfortable rapidity, a response she could not entirely attribute to mere curiosity. She stepped back from the window, pressing her hands to flushed cheeks and commanding herself to composure. It was not until afternoon tea that she was obliged to make her appearance. The Duke and Duchess were present, lending formality that prevented any easy renewal of old friendship. Sebastian rose immediately upon her entrance, executing a bow that would have satisfied the strictest arbiter of etiquette. When he straightened and his eyes met hers, Eloise felt something shift in the very air between them. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds, and they held hers for a moment that stretched beyond propriety before he looked away. He spoke her name, and the sound of it in his deeper, more mature voice sent an inexplicable shiver down her spine. The conversation that followed was everything stilted and unnatural. The Duke remained distant, his manner holding coolness that suggested lingering displeasure over Sebastian's long absence. The dinner that followed was a performance of tense silence. The only sound was the click of silver against porcelain, echoing in the space between unspoken words. The Duke spoke only to the Duchess in a formal tone that effectively excluded his nephew from the conversation. Sebastian, in turn, kept his gaze fixed on his plate, as if the answer to some intractable problem might be found there. The gentleman did not join them. Eloise retired early, pleading fatigue, though in truth she felt restless. Sleep brought dreams of gray eyes and half-remembered laughter. The breakfast room the next morning was not empty as expected. Sebastian stood at the sideboard, and at her entrance he turned with an expression suggesting he was as surprised by her early rising as she was by his presence. For a moment they simply looked at one another, and in that moment Eloise felt the weight of years fall away. This was Sebastian, despite the changes time had wrought. There was something in his eyes, recognition, pleasure, and something else, that made her heart lift. What followed was careful conversation between two people who had once been close, but now found themselves uncertain. Yet beneath mundane topics, Eloise sensed something else, a current of awareness that had not existed in their childhood friendship. She found herself acutely conscious of his physical presence. When he moved to hold her chair, his hand briefly brushed her shoulder, and the contact sent inappropriate warmth through her entire being. When he passed her the marmalade, their fingers touched for the briefest instant, and she nearly dropped the silver pot. This would not do. This was her cousin, or rather, the young man she had been raised to believe was her cousin. Such awareness was entirely improper and must be subdued immediately. Yet despite stern internal lectures, she could not prevent her eyes from following him, could not stop herself from noting the breadth of his shoulders, the strength evident in his hands. The days following Sebastian's return established a peculiar pattern. The Duke's business kept Sebastian occupied for much of each day, yet there were moments when Sebastian and Eloise found themselves in each other's company, and in those moments, something shifted between them. It began with encounters that might have been accidental, but occurred with suspicious frequency. Eloise would be reading in the library, and Sebastian would enter seeking a book. She would be walking in the gardens, and he would appear around a hedge. She would be practicing pianoforte, and he would pause in the doorway, listening with attention that made her fingers stumble over notes she had played flawlessly 1,000 times. One must confess that Eloise was not entirely innocent in these encounters. She found herself choosing the library over her sitting room with increasing frequency, selecting walking routes that passed by the study windows, practicing music at hours when Sebastian was likely at liberty. It was on the 4th day after Sebastian's return that their careful circling came to a head. Eloise had retreated to the library in late afternoon, seeking privacy to examine the items the Duchess had given her, the silver locket, the fine shawl, and the note. She sat in the window seat, afternoon light falling across the yellowed paper as she traced the letters. The handwriting was educated, feminine, written in English but with formations suggesting a writer more comfortable with French. The message was heartbreaking in its brevity. She could not keep her child, but prayed whoever found her would provide love and care she deserved. Signed simply with the initial V. Eloise was so absorbed she did not hear the door open, did not realize she was no longer alone until Sebastian's voice, quiet and gentle, asked whether she was quite all right. She startled violently, nearly dropping the fragile paper, and looked up to find him standing near with an expression of concern. For a moment she considered dissembling, but something in his eyes made her want to tell the truth. The truth came tumbling out in a rush. The looking glass and Lady Montrose's remarks, the family albums and missing miniatures, the letter and the Duchess's revelation. She told him about the shawl and locket and the terrible, wonderful, frightening reality that she was not who she had always believed herself to be. Sebastian listened without interruption, moving closer until he stood directly before her window seat. When she finally fell silent, her breath coming quickly, he did something that breached every rule of propriety but felt entirely natural. He reached out and wiped away a tear trailing down her cheek. His thumb was warm against her skin, the touch gentle beyond measure, and in that moment, Eloise felt something fundamental shift. This was not the touch of a cousin, not casual contact of childhood friendship. This was something else entirely. He withdrew his hand quickly, as though the contact had burned him, and took a step back. But the damage, or perhaps the revelation, was complete. They stared at one another in silence, charged with awareness, with possibility, with terrible knowledge that what lay between them was not simple affection of family. Sebastian recovered first. He asked whether she wished to discover the truth about her origins, and when she confirmed that she did, he offered assistance she had not dared request. He had connections on the continent, resources that might prove useful in tracing the identity of a woman known only by the initial V. If she trusted him, he would help her uncover whatever answers could be found. Eloise accepted his offer with gratitude beyond words. She showed him the artifacts, watched as he examined each with careful attention. The shawl was of a type produced by workshops in Lyon, expensive enough that it would have been owned only by someone of considerable means or by someone connected to the theatrical world. The locket was of French manufacture, the style popular in years immediately preceding the Revolution. As they bent over these remnants, their heads nearly touching, Eloise became acutely aware of how close they were, of warmth radiating from Sebastian's body, a faint scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to him. She found herself wondering what it would be like to close the small distance between them. Such thoughts were madness. Setting aside entirely the question of whether they were cousins by blood, there remained the fact that society viewed them as such. Any romantic connection would be considered highly inappropriate, if not actually scandalous. The first true test came 5 days after Sebastian's return, when Lady Morrison held a ball at her estate. Attendance was obligatory, and the Duke decreed they would all attend. Lord Carstairs appeared early, attaching himself to Eloise with persistence bordering on inappropriate. He claimed her for the first dance and made his intentions embarrassingly clear, speaking of his admiration, of comfort and luxury she would enjoy as his wife, of his desire to see the arrangement settled. Eloise deflected his suit with practiced ease, pleading need to consider such an important decision carefully. Throughout this uncomfortable exchange, she was acutely aware of Sebastian's presence across the ballroom. She caught him looking in her direction more than once, his expression unreadable, but the set of his jaw suggesting displeasure. When Carstairs finally released her, Sebastian appeared at her side with suddenness suggesting he had been waiting. He offered to procure her a plate from the supper room, his tone perfectly polite, but his eyes holding something that made her pulse quicken. They walked together through connecting rooms, maintaining proper distance, yet somehow creating intimacy through the simple act of moving in tandem. Sebastian guided her toward the terrace doors rather than the supper room, and Eloise did not protest. The terrace was blessedly cool after the overheated ballroom. They stood at the balustrade, and for a long moment neither spoke. When Sebastian finally broke the silence, his voice was low and intense. He spoke of Carstairs, of the man's reputation as a fortune hunter who had pursued several heiresses with single-minded determination. He questioned whether Eloise truly understood what marriage to such a man would entail. The vehemence in his voice startled her. As he spoke, a memory surfaced unbidden. Whispers she had overheard the previous season about a young heiress whose engagement to Carstairs had ended abruptly, followed by her family's swift retreat to the continent amid rumors of scandal. Eloise had dismissed it at the time as mere gossip, the sort of malicious speculation that inevitably attached itself to any broken engagement. But Sebastian's warning cast that half-forgotten story in a darker, more sinister light, and she felt a chill of recognition that perhaps her instinctive wariness of Carstairs had been wiser than she knew. She assured him that she had no intention of accepting Carstairs' suit, that her heart remained entirely her own, that she would not marry where she could not love. Sebastian turned to face her fully, and in the silvery light she could see conflict warring in his expression. He moved closer, close enough that propriety demanded she step back, yet she found herself rooted. His hand lifted as though to touch her face, and she held her breath. At that moment, the terrace doors opened to admit Lady Beatrice Hammond with two other young ladies. The spell was broken, and Sebastian stepped back with a bow, excusing himself to return to the ballroom. Lady Beatrice expressed the opinion that it would be a very romantic thing if Eloise and Sebastian were to make a match of it, never mind that they had been raised as cousins. The observation made Eloise's heart sink. She had forgotten that society remained ignorant of the truth. She and Sebastian were not blood relations. Any romantic connection would be viewed through the lens of their supposed cousinship. The scandal would be moderate rather than ruinous, but it would exist. The morning following Lady Morrison's ball brought a development that both thrilled and terrified Eloise. At breakfast, Sebastian appeared with a proposition he presented first to the Duke and Duchess. He had made inquiries regarding the possible origins of the artifacts and had received word that a jeweler in London might be able to identify the maker of the silver locket. The Duke granted permission for Sebastian to pursue this inquiry. More surprisingly, he agreed that Eloise might accompany him to London, provided the Duchess traveled as chaperone. Within 2 days, the party set forth for London. The journey took the better part of a day. Eloise found herself in a state of barely contained excitement that had little to do with uncovering her origins and everything to do with knowledge that Sebastian was a mere carriage length away. During the stop at an inn, propriety demanded they all take their meal together in a private parlor. Sebastian and Eloise found themselves seated across from one another, their knees occasionally brushing beneath the table due to confined space. Each accidental contact sent sparks of awareness through Eloise's entire being. They reached London as evening fell. Waverley House proved imposing and elegant, staffed by servants who attended to their arrival with practiced efficiency. The following morning brought them to the establishment of Monsieur Leblanc, whose shop occupied a discreet storefront in a quiet alley off St. James's Street. The elderly jeweler examined the locket with careful attention, turning it this way and that in the light. After several minutes, he looked up with satisfaction. The locket was indeed French work, created by a master jeweler who had specialized in pieces for the theatrical community, opera singers, famous actresses, dancers. The style suggested it had been commissioned around 1792 or 1793, and the initial V had been added after creation. He suggested that if the locket had been connected to the theatrical world, then records kept by the King's Theatre might contain information about performers whose names began with V. By early afternoon, they found themselves in dusty archives of the King's Theatre, surrounded by ledgers chronicling decades of performances. The Duchess excused herself to pay calls, leaving Eloise and Sebastian alone save for the elderly clerk. They worked in companionable silence, each taking a stack of ledgers. Eloise found herself acutely aware of Sebastian's presence across the small table, of the sound of pages turning, of his occasional murmurs. It was Sebastian who made the discovery as the afternoon light began to fade. He turned the book so she could see, and there, in careful script, was a name that made her heart stutter. Vivienne Rousseau, soprano, French by birth, engaged for seasons of 1792 through 1794. There were notations beside her name, addresses where she had lodged, performances in which she had appeared, and a final entry dated June of 1794, contract terminated, whereabouts unknown. Eloise found herself unable to speak. Sebastian came around the table to stand beside her, his hand settling on her shoulder with warmth and weight that anchored her to the present. Vivienne. Her mother's name had been Vivienne. She was not simply V from an abandoned note, but a real person who had lived and worked and walked the streets of London. They returned to Waverley House as dusk fell, both quiet with the weight of discovery. Dinner that evening was a subdued affair. The Duchess observed their expressions and wisely did not press for details, allowing them space to process what they had learned. Eloise retired early, lying awake in her luxurious bedchamber, her mind turning over that name, Vivienne Rousseau, like a precious jewel, examining it from every angle. The second morning in London brought renewed purpose. Sebastian had made inquiries the previous evening and learned that the former musical director of the King's Theatre, a Mr. Wellesley, still lived in rooms nearby and might be persuaded to grant them audience. Within the hour, they took tea with a gentleman approaching 80 years whose memory proved remarkably sharp. When Sebastian mentioned Vivienne Rousseau, the old man's face lit with recognition. He painted a picture that brought her to life, a young Frenchwoman of extraordinary beauty and exceptional talent, possessed of a voice that could move audiences to tears. She had arrived in London in early 1792 and quickly established herself as one of the most sought-after performers. There had been one patron in particular, he continued quietly, a married gentleman of high rank whose name he would not speak. The affair had been conducted with discretion, but when Vivienne began showing signs of expecting a child, the gentleman had abandoned her with shocking cruelty. Vivienne had continued to perform as long as her condition permitted, but eventually retired from the stage. She had disappeared from public view in spring of 1794, and when she resurfaced months later, there was no child with her, only sorrow that seemed to have aged her beyond her years. She had attempted to resume her career, but the spark that made her exceptional had been extinguished. Mr. Wellesley had heard years later that she had died of consumption in 1810, impoverished and alone. She had been perhaps 32 years old. The tale pierced Eloise's heart with physical pain. This woman had given her life, and then endured the loss with grief that destroyed her gift, and eventually her life itself. The note that had accompanied Eloise's abandonment took on new meaning. This had not been callous rejection, but an act of desperate love. Tears streamed down Eloise's face unchecked, and Sebastian, propriety be damned, drew her against his side, his arm around her shoulders providing support. Mr. Wellesley offered one final piece of information. Vivienne Rousseau was buried in St. Pancras churchyard, her grave marked by a simple stone purchased by fellow performers who had not forgotten her. They went directly to St. Pancras, though afternoon was advancing. The churchyard was peaceful, and it took time to locate the stone bearing Vivienne Rousseau's name. Eloise stood before it in silence, Sebastian remaining a respectful distance behind. The marker was simple, bearing only her name, years of birth and death, and a single line in French. Elle a chanté pour les anges. She sang for the angels. Eloise knelt beside the grave and placed her hand flat against cool stone. She spoke aloud, barely above a whisper, thanking this woman for the gift of life, for the sacrifice made, for loving her enough to ensure she had a better future. When she finally rose, Sebastian stood directly beside her. She turned to him, and without conscious thought, moved into his embrace, burying her face against his shoulder. His arms came around her immediately, holding her with tenderness that spoke of far more than friendship. It was Sebastian who spoke first when they drew apart, his voice rough with emotion. He told her she was remarkable, that she faced the truth with courage that humbled him, that he was honored to have been part of this journey. And then, as they stood in gathering dusk beside Vivienne's grave, he confessed the truth he had been concealing since his return. He had left England 6 years earlier, not simply to escape grief of his mother's death, but to escape his growing awareness of Eloise herself. He had been 18, she merely 15, and he had been horrified to realize his feelings for her were transforming into something entirely inappropriate. He had fled rather than risk acting on desires that seemed forbidden and wrong. The years abroad had not diminished what he felt. If anything, distance had only clarified the truth. Seeing her again had been his undoing. She was no longer the girl he remembered, but a woman who occupied his every waking thought and haunted his dreams. He acknowledged that society viewed them as cousins, that pursuing romantic attachment would invite scandal. He knew he had no right to speak, that his position offered her nothing like the wealth and status Carstairs could provide. But he could no longer remain silent. He was, he stated with quiet intensity, utterly and completely in love with her, had been for years, and would be for all years to come regardless of whether she could return his regard. The declaration left Eloise breathless. She wanted to respond, to tell him she loved him as well, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. They stood thus for a long moment, on the verge of something that would change everything. Sebastian leaned toward her, and Eloise felt her eyes begin to close in anticipation. But the church bell tolling the hour reminded them they were not alone in the world, that the Duchess would be wondering at their prolonged absence, that to be discovered in such a compromising position would create exactly the scandal they wished to avoid. They drew apart with reluctance, but Sebastian maintained possession of her hand a moment longer. He made her promise they would speak further, that she would not dismiss his confession without proper consideration. Eloise promised, though she knew already what her answer would be. The question was not whether she loved him, she did, but rather how they could navigate the complex social waters between them and happiness together. The return journey to Waverley Manor took place in a state of heightened awareness. Eloise found herself constantly conscious of Sebastian's presence, even though propriety demanded they travel in separate carriages. They arrived at Waverley Manor in late afternoon of the second day to find several visiting cards had been left, including 3 from Lord Carstairs. The Duke awaited them in his study, his expression serious. He requested a private audience with Sebastian before the younger man had even removed his traveling coat. Left alone with the Duchess in the drawing room, Eloise found herself unable to settle. She paced before the windows, her mind spinning with possibilities. The Duchess finally spoke with directness. She confirmed that Carstairs had indeed called 3 times in 2 days. More significantly, he had requested and been granted an audience with the Duke earlier that afternoon, before their return. The implications were clear. Carstairs had made a formal offer of marriage, and the Duke would now feel obliged to present it to Eloise for her consideration. The Duchess moved to sit beside her, taking her hand. What followed was a conversation that revealed truths carefully guarded until this moment. Her Grace spoke quietly about the nature of Eloise's relationship to the family, specifically her relationship to Sebastian. They were not, the Duchess confirmed, related by blood in any way. Sebastian was the Duke's nephew by his late brother's marriage, while Eloise was the foundling the Duchess had claimed as her own. There was no legal impediment to a romantic attachment between them. However, society did not know this truth. Society viewed them as cousins and would judge any romantic connection through that lens. The scandal would not be ruinous, but it would exist. Whispers would follow them. Some doors might close, some invitations might cease. The Duchess made no recommendation. She simply laid out realities, then added one final observation. Marriages based on affection, while not unknown, were also not the norm in their circles. That Eloise might have the opportunity to marry for love was itself a privilege not granted to most young women of their class. But she must choose wisely, understanding the full cost of whatever decision she made. It was not until dinner that evening that Eloise saw Sebastian again, and the encounter proved far more painful than she could have anticipated. The Duke presided with usual formal courtesy, making no mention of his conversation with Sebastian or of Carstairs' offer. But Sebastian himself seemed transformed. His expression shuddered, his responses to Eloise's attempts at conversation polite but distant. What Eloise could not know, what the Duchess herself had only intuited, was the nature of the Duke's private interview with his nephew. His Grace, believing sincerely that he was acting in Eloise's best interests, had not merely informed Sebastian of Carstairs' offer. He had spoken at length about the advantages such a match would bring: security, status, freedom from the whispers that would inevitably follow a union between supposed cousins. He had suggested, with the subtle pressure that only a duke and guardian could apply, that if Sebastian truly loved Eloise, he would not stand in the way of such an advantageous settlement. A gentleman, His Grace had implied, sometimes demonstrated love through sacrifice rather than possession. The warmth that had existed in London seemed to have evaporated under the weight of the Duke's expectations, replaced by formality that felt like a physical blow to Eloise. When their eyes met across the table, she saw none of the tenderness glimpsed at Vivian's graveside. Instead, there was something that looked almost like resignation, the expression of a man who had made a terrible decision for what he believed were noble reasons. After dinner, when the Duchess retired early, Eloise found herself alone in the drawing room. She had hoped Sebastian might join her, that they might have opportunity to speak privately. Instead, he excused himself immediately, claiming correspondence required his attention. She did not sleep well, her dreams fragmented and distressing. She woke early with a sense of foreboding that intensified when her maid brought word that Lord Carstairs had called and awaited her in the morning room, having been granted permission by His Grace to speak with her privately. Carstairs was everything a young lady ought to desire in a suitor. Handsome, possessed of both title and wealth, well-connected. What he did not speak of was love or affection, or even genuine regard beyond appreciation of her beauty and accomplishments. His proposal felt transactional, a business arrangement dressed in the language of courtship. She responded with grace, thanking him for the honor while requesting time to consider such an important decision. She would give him her answer before the end of the week. He acquiesced with visible reluctance, taking his leave with a bow that managed to convey both confidence in her eventual acceptance and displeasure at being made to wait. The Duchess found her afterward and drew her into an embrace that provided comfort without words, then suggested gently that perhaps a walk in the gardens might clear her head and heart. Eloise walked for perhaps 20 minutes when she rounded a turn to find Sebastian standing beside the small lake. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, staring across the water with an expression of such bleak sorrow that it stopped her in her tracks. She approached quietly and spoke his name softly. He turned, and for an instant she saw raw emotion before he schooled his expression into something more neutral. Eloise could not bear it. She demanded to know what had changed, why he was treating her with such distance, whether his confession at Vivian's grave had been less sincere than she had believed. What followed was a conversation marked by misunderstanding. Sebastian acknowledged that he had heard of Carstairs' offer, that the Duke had made His Grace's approval quite clear. If Eloise wished to accept Carstairs' suit, Sebastian would not stand in her way. He desired only her happiness, even if that happiness lay with another man. To Eloise, these words sounded like withdrawal, like Sebastian releasing his claim on her heart. She did not understand that his formality masked desperation, that he was attempting to be noble by not pressuring her toward a choice that would bring social difficulty. She responded with wounded pride, suggesting that perhaps she had misunderstood the nature of his feelings, that if he could so easily contemplate her marriage to another, then clearly his confession had not carried the weight she had attributed to it. Sebastian heard in these words acceptance of Carstairs. His expression shuddered completely, and he bowed with formal courtesy. He wished her every happiness in her future union, and excused himself. Eloise watched him walk away, too stunned to call him back. She stood beside the lake, replaying the conversation and recognizing too late all the ways they had misunderstood one another. By the time she returned to the house, Sebastian had departed for London on urgent business. He was not expected to return before week's end, precisely when Eloise had promised to give Carstairs her answer. The days that followed were among the most miserable of Eloise's life. She moved through expected routines with mechanical precision, but her heart was not engaged in any of it. Lady Beatrice called, full of cheerful gossip about the upcoming ball at Lady Morrison's country house, where half the county would be in attendance. Carstairs would expect her answer at the ball, would likely wish to make a public announcement of their engagement if she accepted. And Sebastian would be absent, lost somewhere in London, believing she had chosen Carstairs. The morning of Lady Morrison's ball dawned with deceptive beauty. Eloise had spent the preceding night in wakeful contemplation, finding each possible course of action wanting. She had been resting for perhaps an hour when her maid appeared with word that Lord Carstairs had arrived and requested an audience. The matter must be resolved one way or another. She descended to find Carstairs awaiting her in the drawing room. There was something proprietary in the way he stood near the fireplace, as though he already considered himself master of this space. He wasted no time. Surely by now she had reached a decision regarding his generous offer. He spoke as though her acceptance was a foregone conclusion. Eloise drew herself up and prepared to deliver her refusal. She thanked him for the honor but regretfully must decline. She could not in good conscience accept his suit when her heart remained unengaged. Carstairs' expression transformed. The veneer of gentlemanly courtesy fell away. His voice, when he spoke, held none of its previous warmth. He observed that her refusal was precipitous, that perhaps she did not fully understand the implications. And then, with coldness that made her blood run chill, he mentioned that it would be unfortunate if certain irregularities regarding her origins were to become common knowledge. He had made inquiries. He knew about the circumstances of her birth, about the foundling child that the Duchess had claimed, about the absence of any legal claim to the name and position she enjoyed. Eloise responded with icy precision that would have made her Grace proud. She informed him that whatever information he possessed changed nothing. She would not be coerced into marriage through threats. Carstairs moved closer, his expression hardening. He suggested she reconsider very carefully. Her current comfortable existence depended entirely on the Duke's continued goodwill. If society learned she was merely a foundling of unknown parentage, her position would become untenable. Her only hope of maintaining status was to accept his offer. He would await her answer at the ball that evening. With a bow that somehow managed to convey both confidence and contempt, he departed. For several minutes, Eloise remained frozen. Then, with sudden clarity, she knew what she must do. She could not face this alone. She found the Duchess in her private sitting room and poured out the entire encounter. Her Grace listened with an expression that grew increasingly severe, and when Eloise concluded, the Duchess rose with decisiveness. They would face this together. The Duke must be informed immediately. More than that, it was time for all truths to be revealed, including truths His Grace had kept concealed. Within the hour, Eloise found herself in the Duke's study along with the Duchess. What unfolded over the next hour would alter her understanding of her past in ways she could never have anticipated. The Duke, faced with his wife's insistence and Eloise's distress, spoke with unusual hesitancy. He explained that when Eloise had been found as an infant, he had made discreet inquiries, as any responsible guardian would, attempting to discover her origins. The quality of the items that had accompanied her suggested wealth and status, and he had suspected involvement of someone from the upper ranks of society. But the trail had gone cold quickly. Without a name, without witnesses willing to speak, he had been forced to accept that some mysteries might never be solved. He had put the matter aside as the years passed, focusing instead on raising Eloise as his daughter. Until recently, mere weeks ago in fact, when Lord Lumley had requested a private audience. The elderly peer, facing his own mortality and tormented by decades of guilt, had confessed to being Eloise's father. He had told the Duke the full story: his affair with Vivienne Rousseau, his cowardly abandonment when she became with child, his assumption that she had made arrangements for the infant herself. He had not known, he claimed, that Vivienne had been forced to abandon her baby. He had not known anything beyond his own shame until, by chance, he had heard rumors about the Duke's ward and her mysterious origins. Lord Lumley had come to the Duke seeking permission to acknowledge Eloise privately, to make some provision for her future, to seek forgiveness for failures as a father. His Grace had been considering how to approach this delicate subject, how to tell Eloise and the Duchess this shocking news, how to verify Lumley's claims, how to protect Eloise from potential fortune hunters who might see her newly discovered connection as opportunity, when Carstairs' investigation and subsequent blackmail had forced the matter into the open. The Duke's voice held genuine regret as he explained this. He had wanted to give Eloise time, to present the information gently, to allow her to process her discoveries about Vivian before adding this new layer of complexity. Instead, circumstances had stripped away his ability to control the revelation. As the Duke spoke, the Duchess's hand tightened around Eloise's with almost painful force. Upon her Grace's countenance, there was no shock, no sense of betrayal at having been kept ignorant of Lord Lumley's recent confession, only an intensification of the fierce protectiveness that had always defined her love for Eloise. If anything, the revelation of a biological father seemed only to solidify the Duchess's own claim, earned not through blood, but through 2 decades of devoted care to the title of mother. The words the Duke spoke seemed to reach Eloise from a great distance, each one falling into the stunned silence of her mind like stones dropped into deep water. A low buzzing began in her ears, and the familiar study, with its leather-bound volumes and rich tapestries, where she had spent countless hours reading while the Duke attended to correspondence, suddenly appeared strange and unfamiliar, as though she were seeing it for the first time through eyes that no longer recognized anything as certain. The Duchess took her hand and spoke with fierce tenderness. Whatever Carstairs believed he could accomplish through threats, he was mistaken. The family would stand together, would face down any scandal, would not allow Eloise to be coerced into marriage through fear. As they sat in the study, united in their determination, the door opened to admit an unexpected visitor. Sebastian stood in the entrance, travel-stained and exhausted, his expression transforming to alarm as he took in Eloise's pale face and the grim determination evident in both the Duke and Duchess. He had returned early from London, unable to bear remaining away when Eloise faced giving her answer to Carstairs. Whatever his own feelings, whatever misunderstandings lay between them, he would not leave her to face such a momentous decision without support. The Duke related the morning's events in terse sentences. As the tale unfolded, Sebastian's expression darkened with fury. When His Grace concluded, Sebastian turned to Eloise with eyes that burned with intensity. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to one knee before her chair, propriety abandoned entirely. He took her hands in his, heedless of the Duke and Duchess witnessing this display, and spoke with passion that left no room for misunderstanding. He loved her, had loved her for years, and would love her until his dying breath. He had no fortune to match Carstairs, no grand estate, nothing but himself, and a heart that beat solely for her. But if she would have him, if she could find it in herself to accept him, despite the moderate scandal their union might cause, he would spend every day of his life ensuring she never regretted choosing him. He acknowledged the confusion of their last conversation, took full responsibility for the misunderstanding. He had been trying to be noble, to give her freedom to choose the advantageous match without pressure from him. He had been a fool, and he begged her forgiveness. And then, with a glance toward the Duke and Duchess that sought permission even as he proceeded, he asked Eloise to be his wife. Eloise, tears streaming freely, could not speak past the emotion that closed her throat. Instead, she nodded emphatically, her hands tightening on his. Sebastian rose and drew her into his arms, and for a moment the Duke's study faded away. There was only this: the warmth of his embrace, the solid reality of his presence, the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The Duke cleared his throat, a sound that held equal parts approval and amusement. He observed that this was highly irregular, that proper courtship had not been observed, that half the county would have opinions about cousins marrying. And then, with warmth that Eloise had rarely heard from him, he gave his blessing. The Duchess was openly weeping, her face radiant with joy. She confirmed what she had told Eloise. There was no blood relation between them, no legal impediment, nothing but social convention that might object. What remained was the matter of Carstairs and the ball that evening. They could not allow him to continue in his belief that Eloise would accept his suit or that his threats held power. Sebastian, still holding Eloise, suggested with quiet steel that perhaps Lord Carstairs needed to understand that Eloise was not without protectors, that his attempts at coercion would not be tolerated. The Duke agreed, and what followed was a planning session that mapped out precisely how the evening would unfold. They would attend the ball as a united family, would present an unshakable front, would ensure Carstairs understood his defeat before he could make his threats public. And if scandal came regardless, if society chose to judge them harshly for Sebastian and Eloise's union, they would weather it together, secure in the knowledge that their choice was made from love rather than obligation. As the family dispersed to prepare for the battle that lay ahead, the Duke retired briefly to his study. A messenger was dispatched to London, carrying a note for Lord Lumley. The message was succinct, detailing the blackmail and the imminent public confrontation at Lady Morrison's ball. The Duke made no request. He simply presented his lordship with the opportunity to defend the blood of his blood. The choice to attend would be entirely Lord Lumley's. As afternoon advanced and preparations began, Eloise found herself alone with Sebastian in the garden. They walked hand in hand, speaking quietly of the future they would build together. Sebastian told her of his plans. He had used his time abroad to make investments that had proven successful. He could not offer her the luxury Carstairs promised, but neither would she want for necessities. More importantly, he offered her partnership, respect, freedom to be herself. Eloise responded that she had never desired luxury for its own sake, that the modest means Sebastian described sounded like riches beyond measure when accompanied by love. She spoke of her own desires, to honor Vivienne's memory in some meaningful way, perhaps by establishing support for women in difficult circumstances. As evening approached, Sebastian caught her hand one final time. He drew her into the shadow of an alcove and kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak and her heart sore. It was her first kiss, and it was everything, sweet and searching, promising everything and demanding nothing. When they finally drew apart, Sebastian touched his forehead to hers and whispered a promise that no matter what occurred at the ball, she was his and he was hers, now and forever. Lady Morrison's ball was already well underway when the party from Waverley Manor arrived, their entrance timed to ensure maximum impact. The Duke led the way with his Duchess, both wearing expressions of aristocratic composure. Behind them came Sebastian and Eloise, walking side by side in a manner that immediately drew every eye. One must confess that they made a striking couple. The way they moved together, the subtle synchronization of their steps, the awareness evident in every glance, announced to anyone with eyes to see that something significant had shifted. The ballroom fell into one of those peculiar silences. Conversations died mid-sentence as guests turned to stare. Lady Morrison herself advanced with an expression that mixed delight at drama about to unfold with concern about potential scandal occurring under her roof. Lord Carstairs stood near the refreshment table until the sudden hush alerted him to new arrivals. When he turned and saw Eloise on Sebastian's arm, his expression transformed. Surprise, displeasure, calculation, and finally cold fury concealed beneath polite greeting. He approached, bowing first to the Duke and Duchess before turning attention to Eloise. His words were perfectly proper, his inquiry about her health impeccable. But his eyes held a warning, a reminder of threats he had made. Eloise met his gaze without flinching. She responded with equal courtesy, then, with deliberate intent, introduced Sebastian as her affianced husband. The words fell into the assembled company like a stone into still water. Whispers erupted immediately. Cousins marrying, how extraordinary, how irregular, was such a thing quite proper? Carstairs' mask of civility cracked visibly. He requested a private word with Eloise. The Duke intervened smoothly, observing that anything Lord Carstairs wished to say could be said before him, as Eloise's guardian. What followed was a confrontation that would be discussed in drawing rooms for months. Carstairs, abandoning all pretense of gentlemanly behavior, accused Eloise of leading him to believe she would accept his suit. He spoke of time invested in courting her, of expectations he had been encouraged to form, of his right to an explanation. The Duke responded with icy precision that no promises had been made, no formal understanding established, and that his ward was entirely within her rights to refuse any suit that did not please her. Carstairs, his face flushed with fury and humiliation, in his rage abandoned every pretense of gentlemanly conduct. He announced to the assembled company that perhaps they did not understand the full nature of what they were condoning. Miss Grenville, and here he emphasized the name with contempt, was not who she pretended to be. She was a foundling, a bastard child of unknown parentage, raised above her station through the Duchess's misguided charity. The gasps that greeted this revelation were entirely genuine. But before whispers could transform into condemnation, an unexpected voice cut through the chaos. Lord Lumley, who had been standing near the windows, stepped forward with dignity that commanded immediate attention. He was an imposing figure despite his years, his bearing that of a man accustomed to authority. He confirmed that yes, Miss Grenville was indeed not of legitimate birth. She was, in fact, his daughter by Vivienne Rousseau, a woman he had loved, but lacked courage to stand by when she needed him most. He had failed both mother and child through cowardice and concern for his reputation, an error he regretted more deeply with each passing year. The Duke and Duchess had given his daughter a life he could not provide, had raised her with love and care he had no right to expect. That he was now standing before society, admitting his connection, was not because of Lord Carstairs' threats, but because he could no longer bear the dishonor of denying his own child. Miss Grenville was beloved by the Duke and Duchess, was affianced to a gentleman of good family and excellent character, and would inherit from him upon his death such property as he could legally bequeath to her. Any man who thought to use the circumstances of her birth as leverage for coercion was beneath contempt. The impact of Lord Lumley's statement was profound. To have a peer of his standing publicly acknowledge an illegitimate daughter was shocking, certainly, but also strangely admirable. His frank admission of his own failures, his evident remorse, and his clear affection for Eloise transformed the narrative from one of scandalous deception to one of family loyalty and redemption. The Duchess moved to stand beside Eloise, placing an arm around her shoulders. She addressed the assembly with quiet dignity, confirming that she had indeed found Eloise as an infant and chosen to raise her as her own daughter. That decision had brought her more joy than she could express. Eloise was her daughter in every way that mattered, and the Duchess would stand by her against any attempt to diminish or shame her. Sebastian finally spoke. His words were simple, but carried absolute conviction. He announced that he had loved Eloise since they were children together, that his years abroad had only strengthened that love, and that he considered himself the most fortunate of men that she had consented to be his wife. They were not related by blood, society's concerns about cousinship notwithstanding, and he would thank anyone who had objections to address them to him directly. The challenge implicit in his tone was unmistakable, as was the protectiveness in his stance. Eloise herself, surrounded by her family's support, found her voice. She addressed the assembly with composure that would have made Vivienne Rousseau proud, speaking of the mother she had never known, of the sacrifice that had given her chance at life, of the family who had chosen to love her. She acknowledged the irregularity of her situation while refusing to apologize for circumstances beyond her control. She was Eloise Grenville, adopted daughter of the Duke and Duchess of Waverley, biological daughter of Vivienne Rousseau and Lord Lumley, affianced wife of Lord Sebastian Marlowe. Each of these identities was true, and none cancelled out the others. When she concluded, the silence that followed held a quality of respect. Lady Morrison was the first to move, crossing the ballroom to embrace Eloise with genuine warmth and declaring that anyone who thought less of Miss Grenville for the circumstances of her birth was not welcome in her home. Other guests followed, though not all. Some families departed immediately, their disapproval evident. Lady Montrose and her coterie withdrew to the far side of the ballroom. But a surprising number of guests remained, and many approached to offer congratulations and support. Lady Beatrice arrived in a flurry of silk and enthusiasm, embracing Eloise with such force, both nearly toppled. She declared it the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed. Lord Carstairs himself had vanished during the confrontation. But word would soon spread about his behavior, about his attempt to coerce an innocent young woman through blackmail. Several gentlemen made pointed comments about the necessity of maintaining honor, observations clearly intended to reach Carstairs' ears. Sebastian and Eloise took to the dance floor for the first time as an engaged couple, their waltz drawing every eye. They moved together with unconscious grace, lost in their own world despite the dozens of spectators. The evening progressed, the ball resuming something approximating normal activity, though conversations were decidedly more animated than usual. It was near midnight when the party from Waverley Manor finally departed, exhausted but triumphant. The carriage ride home was marked by comfortable silence. The Duke observed that they had weathered the storm admirably, that the scandal would be significant but manageable, that time and Eloise's evident worth would eventually overcome most objections. Lord Lumley had requested permission to call upon Eloise. He wished to establish a relationship with his daughter, to make what amends he could. The decision whether to receive him rested entirely with Eloise. Eloise considered this in silence, her hand clasped in Sebastian's. She decided that yes, she would receive Lord Lumley, not because she owed him anything, but because she had learned through her own search for origins that understanding one's past was essential to building one's future. The Duchess mentioned that they must begin planning the wedding immediately. A long engagement would serve no purpose. Better to marry quickly, establish themselves as a devoted couple, and allow society to adjust to their union as an accomplished fact. By the time they arrived at Waverley Manor, it had been decided. They would marry within the month, in the chapel on the estate, with only their closest friends and family in attendance. The residence that Sebastian and Eloise established some 20 miles from Waverley Manor was not grand by aristocratic standards, but it was beautiful in its simplicity and warmth. 2 years had transformed the scandal of their union into a story that society had come to view with something approaching approval. Not universal acceptance, certainly, but recognition that their love had proven genuine and enduring. Eloise sat in the nursery of their modest manor house, her infant son cradled in her arms, while Sebastian stood by the window watching the sun set over their gardens. The baby, named Richard for his grandfather and bearing the middle name Vivian in honor of the grandmother he would never know, slept peacefully, his tiny fist curled against her bodice, his breathing steady and soft. The Vivian Rousseau Memorial Fund had become Eloise's great passion, providing assistance to women in theatrical professions who found themselves in difficult circumstances. The Duchess had been instrumental in establishing the fund's credibility, lending both her name and considerable financial support. Even some of the matrons who had initially disapproved of Eloise's irregular birth had been moved by the charity's mission, recognizing in it both compassion and practical good sense. Lord Lumley had indeed become part of their lives, a tentative but growing relationship that brought him visible peace in his final years. He doted on his grandson with the devotion he had denied his own daughter, attempting through this new generation to make amends for failures of the past. Eloise had found that she could not hate this man who had abandoned her mother. She could only feel sadness for all that had been lost to fear and social convention. The Duke and Duchess visited regularly, their pride in Eloise evident in every interaction. Her Grace had been proven correct in her assertion that blood mattered less than love, and even His Grace, initially so concerned with propriety and social standing, had softened considerably when faced with evidence of his adopted daughter's happiness. He had privately apologized to Sebastian for the pressure he had applied during that conversation before the ball, acknowledging that his attempt to guide his nephew toward nobility had nearly destroyed the very happiness he claimed to seek for Eloise. Society had adjusted, as society always did. Some families never reconciled themselves to the circumstances of Eloise's birth or the irregularity of cousins marrying, but others, particularly younger members of the ton, found their story romantic rather than scandalous. Lady Jersey had been true to her word, receiving them at Almack's and making clear through her patronage that they were not to be ostracized. As darkness settled over the countryside and the baby stirred in Eloise's arms, Sebastian crossed the room to sit beside his wife. He touched his son's cheek with gentle fingers, then leaned over to kiss Eloise with the tenderness that had never diminished in 2 years of marriage. Outside, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same constellations Sebastian had taught her to identify when they were children. Through the nursery window, she could see them emerging one by one, ancient patterns that had guided travelers for millennia, constant and unchanging despite all the tumult of human lives below. The weight of her son in her arms was real and present, grounding her in this moment. Sebastian's hand found hers, his fingers warm and familiar, and she laced her own through his with the ease of long practice. The room smelled of lavender and milk, and the beeswax candles that burned low in their sconces, casting soft shadows that danced gently on the walls. There were no questions anymore, no restless searching in mirrors for features that did not match the family portraits. She knew where she had come from Vivian's desperate love, from Catherine's healing grief, from a convergence of tragedy and grace that had given her life twice over. And she knew where she belonged, here, in this quiet room with her husband and child, in this modest house that held more warmth than any palace, in this life built not on bloodlines or social standing, but on the simple, revolutionary choice to love and be loved in return. The mirror on the nursery wall reflected back not a young woman lost and searching, but a mother secure in her place, a wife content in her choice, a woman who had found in seeking truth not destruction, but liberation. There were no more questions in that reflection, only the quiet certainty of a heart, finally, completely at home. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society.